The lock turned twice before the door finally gave way, and Alina hardly pressed herself against the cold stone wall, listening. Footsteps, heavy ones, not the soft shuffle of the old housekeeper who brought her meals twice a day, but something else entirely. Someone new. She had learned over the years to read every sound in this forgotten wing of Thornfield Manor. The creak of the third floorboard meant someone was checking on her. The rattle of keys meant food or water. But this sound, this steady, confident stride, belonged to no one she knew. Alina's heart pounded. She had not seen a stranger in this house for as long as she could remember. Visitors never came to this part of the estate. The servants who guarded her had made certain of that. Windows nailed shut, doors bolted from the outside. A world reduced to four walls and a single barred window that let in only a sliver of gray light. She backed further into the shadows of the small room, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Whoever was coming, she told herself, could not be trusted. No one who came to this wing ever meant her well. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. "Is someone in there?" A man's voice called out, deep and unfamiliar, tinged with surprise rather than cruelty. Alina said nothing. She had learned silence long ago. Silence kept her safe. Silence meant fewer questions, fewer punishments, fewer reasons for the ones who controlled her life to grow angry. But then she heard something she had never heard before in this house, the sound of someone trying to help. "The door's locked from the outside," the voice muttered, more to himself than to her. Why would anyone lock a door from the outside in an empty wing? There was a pause, then the scrape of metal against metal as he worked at the lock. Alina's breath caught. Was this a trick? Had her keepers sent someone new to test her, to see if she would call out and reveal herself as troublesome, as difficult, as everything they claimed her to be? Yet something in the man's voice made her hesitate. It did not carry the practiced coldness of the housekeeper, nor the impatience of the men who occasionally came to check that she was still contained, still quiet, still forgotten. The lock gave way with a final click, and the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was a man Alina had never seen in her life. Tall, dressed in fine traveling clothes that spoke of wealth and station, his dark hair slightly disheveled from what looked like a long journey. His eyes, when they found her, widened with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like horror. "Good heavens," he breathed, "there's someone actually living here." Alina pressed herself further against the wall, unable to find her voice. Years of isolation had left her unaccustomed to speaking with strangers, and this man, whoever he was, looked at her not with suspicion or irritation, but with genuine alarm. "Please," she finally managed, her voice hoarse from disuse, "please don't tell them you found me." The man took a step closer, then stopped himself, clearly sensing her fear. "Tell who? Who exactly is keeping you here?" Alina studied him carefully. His clothes were far too fine for a servant, and his manner far too commanding for a simple visitor. Yet Thornfield Manor had not seen a master in residence for as long as she had been trapped within its walls. "Who are you?" she asked instead, her voice trembling. "My name is Alexander Ashworth," he said, straightening slightly, as though the introduction might somehow steady the strange scene before him. "I am the Duke of Thornfield. I inherited this estate 3 days ago from a relative I barely knew. I only arrived this afternoon to survey the property before deciding whether to sell it." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the bare room, the single narrow bed, the untouched tray of food gone cold on a small table. "I had no idea anyone was living here. My solicitors made no mention of any residence." Alina felt something inside her chest tighten, a strange and unfamiliar mixture of hope and disbelief. A duke, the rightful owner of the very house that had become her prison. "How long have you been here?" Alexander asked, his voice gentler now, though the alarm had not left his eyes. Alina hesitated. The question, so simple on its surface, opened a door in her mind she had long kept shut. How long had it truly been? The seasons had blurred together into an endless gray rhythm of silence and confinement. She had stopped marking the days somewhere around the third year, when hope had become too painful to hold on to. Years, she finally whispered. I don't know exactly how many. I stopped counting. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at her as though trying to comprehend the full weight of what she had just told him. Who did this to you? He asked, his voice low, controlled, though she could hear the anger simmering beneath it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, and others who work for her. They said I was unwell, that I needed to be kept safe, away from people, away from anything that might upset me. Alina's hands twisted together nervously. They said it was for my own protection. Do you believe that? Alexander asked. Alina met his eyes for the first time since he had entered the room, and something in her expression hardened. The ghost of a woman who had once known her own mind before the world had tried to convince her otherwise. No, she said, I never believed that, not for one single day. Alexander crossed the room slowly, taking in the details she had long since stopped noticing herself. The thin blanket, the absence of any personal belongings, the bars on the window that had clearly been installed with purpose, not left over from some earlier use of the room. What is your name? He asked. Alina Hartley. The name seemed to strike something in him, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he quickly masked it. Hartley, he repeated quietly. That name was mentioned in my late relative's papers. A ward, I believe. A young woman who was said to have left the estate years ago to live with distant family in the north. Alina let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. I never left this house. I was never permitted to leave. Alexander's expression darkened further. He turned toward the door, then back to her, clearly torn between wanting answers and recognizing that she needed something far more immediate than an interrogation. You're coming with me, he said suddenly, his voice firm with resolve. Right now. I don't know the full story yet, and I intend to find out every detail, but I will not leave you locked in this room for one more hour. Alina stared at him, uncertain whether to trust the sudden shift in her circumstances. Rescue, real rescue, had never once come to her in all the years she had waited and hoped, and eventually stopped hopping altogether. You don't even know me, she said quietly. I know enough, Alexander replied. I know that no person should be locked away like this, whatever the reason given. And I know that as the master of this house, whether I like it or not, what has happened here is now my responsibility to correct. He extended his hand toward her, an unfamiliar gesture of trust that Alina found herself staring at for a long moment before finally, cautiously, she reached out and let her fingers rest against his. I am taking her home, Alexander declared, though whether he spoke to Alina, to himself, or to the empty corridor beyond the door, she could not tell. He did not yet know how deep her imprisonment had run, how many people had built their comfort upon her silence, or how far some among them would go to make certain she never spoke of what had truly happened within these walls. As they stepped out of the small room together, Alina felt the corridor stretch before her like an unfamiliar country, wide and uncertain, and terrifying in its openness. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to walk somewhere without permission, to move through a space that was not measured in the few feet between her bed and her door. Behind them, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Mrs. Doyle appeared at the end of the corridor, her face draining of color the moment she saw Alina standing beside the new Duke. Your Grace, the housekeeper said quickly, her voice pitched with false calm, I can explain. The girl is unwell, she has been for years. It is not safe for her to. I did not ask for an explanation, Alexander cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. I asked no one anything, because until this moment I had no idea a woman was being kept prisoner in my own house. You will explain yourself to my solicitor, and to whatever authorities become necessary, once I understand the full scope of what has occurred here. Mrs. Doyle's composure cracked slightly, her eyes darting between Alexander and Alina with barely concealed panic. "Your Grace, there are matters here you do not understand. Family matters. Matters that were settled long before you inherited this estate. Then you will have every opportunity to make me understand them," Alexander replied evenly. "But not today, and not while this young woman remains under this roof for another moment." He guided Alina past the housekeeper, down the main staircase she had not walked in years, past rooms she barely recognized from a childhood that felt as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The house looked different from this angle, grander and stranger all at once, a place she had once called home before it had become something far darker. Outside, the afternoon light struck her eyes with a brightness that made her wince and raise a hand to shield her face. She had forgotten how the sun felt against her skin, how the air smelled different beyond the confines of a single locked room. Alexander's carriage waited at the end of the drive, and as he helped her inside, Alina allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine that perhaps her story was not yet finished. Perhaps there was still a chapter left to write, one that did not end within those four silent walls. But even as the carriage pulled away from Thornfield Manor, Alina caught sight of Mrs. Doyle standing rigid in the doorway, watching them leave with an expression that was not simply fear, but something closer to calculation. Whatever secrets had kept Alina locked away for years, she understood in that moment that they were far from finished unraveling, and that the danger she had lived beside for so long had not ended the moment she stepped outside those walls. It had only just begun to shift into something new. Alexander sat across from her in the carriage, his expression thoughtful and troubled as the manor grew smaller behind them. He did not yet know the name of the person who had truly orchestrated Alina's imprisonment, nor the reason behind it, but he understood with growing certainty that the answers lay buried somewhere in his own inheritance, in papers and letters he had not yet had reason to examine closely. Alina watched the passing countryside through the carriage window, greener and wider than anything she had seen in years, and felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes. She did not know this man beside her, did not know what waited for her beyond this single moment of rescue, but for the first time since she could remember, she allowed herself to feel something she had long believed lost to her entirely. Hope. The carriage rolled through the gates of Ashworth House just as evening settled over the countryside, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. Alina had said little during the journey, her eyes fixed on the passing world outside the window as though she feared it might vanish if she looked away for even a moment. Alexander respected her silence, understanding instinctively that whatever words she needed would come only when she was ready to offer them. The house itself rose before them, warm light glowing from its many windows, a stark contrast to the cold stone corridors of Thornfield Manor. Alina hesitated at the carriage door, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the frame. "It's only a house," Alexander said gently, noticing her hesitation. "No locked doors here that you cannot open yourself." Alina managed a small, uncertain nod and stepped down onto the gravel drive. The housekeeper of Ashworth House, a kind-faced woman named Margaret Wells, hurried out to greet them, her expression shifting quickly from polite curiosity to genuine concern as she took in Alina's thin frame and worn clothing. "Your Grace," Margaret said carefully, "might I ask who our guest is?" "Miss Alina Hartley will be staying with us," Alexander replied. "She requires rest, proper meals, and whatever comforts you can provide. I will explain the full circumstances later, but for now, please see that she has everything she needs." Margaret nodded without further question, though her eyes lingered on Alina with quiet sympathy as she led her inside. Alina followed, glancing back once at Alexander, who remained standing in the drive, his expression distant and thoughtful, already turning over the mystery that had unfolded before him. That evening, after Alina had been settled into a warm room with a proper bed and a fire crackling in the hearth, Alexander retreated to his study. He had inherited Thornfield Manor from his great-uncle, Lord Reginald Ashworth, a man he had met perhaps twice in his life, both occasions brief and formal. The estate had come to him almost by accident, a distant branch of the family tree suddenly thrust into prominence when no closer heir could be found. He pulled out the small collection of documents his solicitor had provided upon his inheritance, spreading them across his desk with careful attention. Most of the papers concerned the estate's finances, tenant agreements, and the usual administrative matters that accompanied any large property. But buried among them was a single folder marked with Aliner's name. The contents were sparse, deliberately so, Alexander suspected. A brief note indicating that Aliner Hartley had been the ward of Lord Reginald Ashworth since childhood, her parents having died when she was young. A mention of an inheritance set aside for her, to be granted upon her reaching the age of 25, or upon her marriage, whichever came first. And then, abruptly, a single line noting that Miss Hartley had left the estate to reside with distant relatives, her guardianship formally concluded. Alexander frowned, reading the line again. If Aliner had left the estate years ago, as the documents claimed, how had she come to be locked away in a forgotten wing of the very house she was said to have departed? He set the papers aside and made his way back upstairs, knocking softly on the door of the room where Aliner had been settled. She answered after a moment, wrapped in a warm robe, her hair still damp from a bath, looking somehow both younger and more fragile than she had appeared at Thornfield. "I don't mean to disturb you," Alexander said, "but I found some papers regarding your guardianship. I wondered if you might be willing to tell me more when you feel ready." Aliner studied him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him enter. She settled into a chair near the fire, and Alexander took the seat across from her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Lord Reginald was my guardian," Aliner began slowly, her voice steadier than it had been earlier, though still touched with hesitation. "My parents died when I was 7 years old. He was a distant cousin of my mother, and he took me in out of some sense of family obligation, I think, rather than any real affection. I grew up at Thornfield, mostly alone, with tutors and servants for company." "And the inheritance?" Alexander prompted gently. "My father had left a considerable sum, meant to be held in trust until I came of age or married. Lord Reginald managed it on my behalf." Aliner's hands tightened in her lap. "When I turned 23, I began asking questions about the state of my inheritance. I wanted to understand my own finances, to have some say in my future. Lord Reginald grew increasingly evasive, and then increasingly hostile toward my questions." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "What happened then?" "There was a cousin," Aliner continued, her voice growing quieter. "Edmund Whitfield, a relative of Lord Reginald's who visited the estate frequently in those years. He began suggesting that I sign documents transferring control of my inheritance to him, claiming it would be safer, easier to manage, less burdensome for a young woman alone in the world. I refused. I told him I intended to manage my own affairs once I came of age." "And—" Aliner drew a shaky breath. "Shortly after that, Lord Reginald began telling people that I had grown unwell, that my mind was troubled, that I suffered from fits of hysteria and confusion. I did not understand at first why he would say such things when nothing about me had changed. But slowly, the servants began treating me differently. Doors that had once been open to me were locked. My correspondence stopped being sent. And then one day, I was moved to the old servants' wing, told it was for my own safety, and the door was locked behind me." Alexander sat in stunned silence, the full weight of what she was describing settling over him like a heavy stone. "They fabricated an illness to justify imprisoning you." "Yes," Aliner said simply. "And once I was locked away, no one questioned it further. Lord Reginald told the few relatives who asked that I had gone to live with family in the north, recovering from my troubles in quiet seclusion. No one came looking for me. No one thought to." How long ago did this happen? Alina closed her eyes briefly, as though calculating the years cost her something painful. Nearly 6 years ago now, I believe, perhaps closer to 7. Alexander felt a cold anger settling in his chest, sharper and more focused than the shock he had felt upon first discovering her. 6 or 7 years, stolen from a young woman's life, simply because she had refused to hand over what rightfully belonged to her. And this cousin, Edmund Whitfield, Alexander said slowly. Do you know what became of him, whether he still has any connection to the estate or to your inheritance? Alina's expression grew troubled. I don't know for certain. Lord Reginald mentioned him occasionally in the early years of my confinement, when Mrs. Doyle would sometimes speak carelessly in front of me, forgetting perhaps that I could still hear and understand everything around me even if I was not permitted to respond. I believe Edmund continued managing much of the estate's finances, including whatever remained of my inheritance, in the years since. Alexander rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, staring out at the darkened grounds of Ashworth House, while he processed everything Alina had told him. If Edmund Whitfield had indeed continued managing Alina's inheritance in her absence, and if Lord Reginald's death had transferred certain estate matters into new hands, there was a very real possibility that significant sums of money had been quietly diverted or stolen entirely under the pretense of Alina's supposed incapacity. I intend to look into this matter thoroughly, Alexander said finally, turning back to face her. I will contact my solicitor first thing tomorrow morning, and I will request a complete accounting of your inheritance, as well as any documents relating to your guardianship and the circumstances of your confinement. Alina watched him carefully, a flicker of something crossing her face that seemed caught between hope and hesitation. Why would you go to such trouble for someone you only just met? Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. Because what happened to you was wrong in every possible sense. And because, whether I like it or not, I have inherited a great many things from Lord Reginald Ashworth, including a responsibility to correct the wrongs committed under his name. Alina lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I don't know how to thank you for what you've already done. You need not thank me, Alexander replied. You need only rest and allow yourself time to heal from everything you have endured. The rest I intend to handle myself. Over the following days, Alina slowly began adjusting to her new surroundings, though the process was neither swift nor simple. Small things overwhelmed her in ways that surprised even herself. The sound of a door left unlocked at night sent her into moments of quiet panic, until she reminded herself that no one intended to trap her within the room. The sight of an open window, sunlight streaming freely across the floor, sometimes brought unexpected tears to her eyes, a reaction she struggled to explain even to herself. Margaret Wells, the housekeeper, proved endlessly patient, gently guiding Alina through the rhythms of daily life at Ashworth House without ever pressing for explanations she was not yet ready to give. Slowly, Alina began to eat proper meals again, to sleep through full nights without waking in confusion, to walk the gardens each morning and marvel at the simple freedom of choosing her own path among the flower beds and hedges. Alexander, meanwhile, threw himself into investigating the circumstances of her confinement with a determination that surprised even his own household staff. He wrote to his solicitor, requesting immediate access to all financial records related to Alina's inheritance, as well as any correspondence between Lord Reginald and Edmund Whitfield in the years following her confinement. The response, when it arrived nearly a week later, only deepened Alexander's suspicions. The solicitor reported that significant portions of Alina's trust had indeed been withdrawn over the years, authorized by signatures claiming to be Alina's own, despite the fact that she had been locked away and unable to sign anything at all during that time. The forgeries, though carefully executed, showed subtle inconsistencies that a careful examination could reveal, particularly when compared against samples of Alina's genuine handwriting from before her confinement. Alexander brought the findings to Alina one afternoon as she sat in the garden, a book resting unopened in her lap, while she simply enjoyed the warmth of the sun against her skin. "I have troubling news," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "It appears that documents bearing your forged signature have been used repeatedly over the past several years to authorize withdrawals from your inheritance. Someone has been systematically draining the funds meant to be yours." Alina's expression hardened, though he noticed she did not seem entirely surprised by the revelation. "Edmund," she said quietly, "it has to be him. He was always far too interested in my finances for a man who claimed no personal stake in the matter." "I suspect the same," Alexander agreed. "But suspicion alone will not be enough. If we intend to see justice done and to recover what rightfully belongs to you, we will need concrete evidence. Testimony from those who witnessed your confinement, proof of the forgeries, a clear record establishing that you were never given the opportunity to authorize any of these transactions yourself." Alina was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the garden with an expression Alexander could not quite read. "There was a servant," she said finally. "A young woman named Hannah who worked in the kitchens at Thornfield. She used to bring my meals sometimes when Mrs. Doyle was occupied elsewhere. She was kind to me, in small ways she could manage without drawing attention. I believe she may have suspected the truth of what was happening, even if she never spoke of it openly." "Do you know where she might be now?" "I don't know for certain," Alina admitted, "but she once mentioned that her family lived in the village near Thornfield. It's possible she still resides there, or that someone in the village might know how to reach her." Alexander nodded, already calculating the next steps in his mind. "I will send someone to inquire discreetly. If she is willing to speak to what she witnessed, her testimony could prove invaluable." As the days passed, Alexander divided his time between managing the practical investigation into Alina's stolen inheritance and simply spending time in her company, drawn increasingly to her quiet strength and the sharp intelligence that had clearly survived years of attempted suppression. Alina, in turn, found herself gradually opening up to him in ways she had not expected, sharing small memories of her childhood, her interests, the dreams she had once held before her world had narrowed to the confines of a single locked room. Yet even as their friendship deepened, an undercurrent of tension remained ever present. Word of Alina's reappearance, however carefully Alexander had tried to keep the matter private, had begun to spread through certain circles of society. Whispers reached him through his own household staff, rumors of a mad ward resurfacing after years of supposed seclusion, questions about her sanity and her sudden reappearance under the protection of a duke she had known for less than a fortnight. Alexander did his best to shield Alina from the worst of these rumors, but he understood with growing certainty that whoever had orchestrated her confinement would not simply allow the truth to surface without a fight. Edmund Whitfield, if he was indeed responsible for the years of stolen inheritance and manufactured illness, stood to lose everything should the full truth come to light. One evening, as Alexander reviewed the latest correspondence from his solicitor, a letter arrived that sent a fresh wave of concern through him. A lawyer representing Edmund Whitfield had written requesting an urgent meeting, citing concerns over Alina's well-being and questioning the propriety of her current living arrangements under Alexander's roof. Alexander read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. The message was carefully worded, couched in polite concern, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. Edmund Whitfield knew Alina had been found, and he intended to act quickly to protect whatever remained of his stolen fortune, and to silence the woman whose very existence threatened to expose everything he had built upon her suffering. Alexander folded the letter carefully and made his way to find Alina, understanding that whatever peace she had begun to find within the walls of Ashworth House was about to be tested in ways neither of them could yet fully predict. Alina sat in the study, her hands folded tightly in her lap, listening as Alexander read the lawyer's letter aloud. Each word seemed to tighten something inside her chest, a familiar dread she had hoped never to feel again after leaving Thornfield behind. "He wants a meeting," Alexander said, setting the letter down on his desk. "Under the guise of concern for your well-being, but I have no doubt his true purpose is to assess how much of a threat you now pose to him." "He will not simply let this rest," Alina said quietly. "He never intended for anyone to find me. My continued existence, free and able to speak, undermines everything he has spent years building on my silence." Alexander studied her carefully, nodding the way her hands trembled slightly despite her steady voice. "Are you afraid of him?" Alina considered the question honestly before answering. "I was for a long time, but fear alone kept me silent for years, and silence only allowed him to continue stealing what was mine. I don't intend to let fear control me any longer, whatever comes next." Something in her resolve seemed to strengthen Alexander's own determination. "Then we will face this together. I will agree to the meeting, but on my own terms and in my own home, where I can ensure your safety throughout." Over the following days, Alexander focused his efforts on gathering as much evidence as possible before the scheduled meeting with Edmund Whitfield's lawyer. He sent a trusted servant to the village near Thornfield to locate Hannah, the kitchen maid Alina had mentioned, hoping her testimony might provide crucial support for their case. The servant returned 3 days later with promising news. Hannah, now working in a modest household in the village, had agreed to meet with Alexander personally, though she had expressed considerable nervousness about the prospect of testifying against her former employers. Alexander traveled to the village himself, understanding the delicate nature of the conversation ahead. He found Hannah in the small cottage where she now lodged, a young woman perhaps a few years older than Alina, with kind eyes that carried the weight of secrets long kept. "Your Grace," Hannah said nervously, curtsying as she opened the door, "I understand you wish to speak with me about Miss Hartley." "I do," Alexander confirmed gently. "I understand this may be difficult for you, but I assure you that Miss Hartley is safe now, and any information you can provide would help ensure that those responsible for her suffering are held accountable." Hannah led him inside, settling nervously across from him at a small wooden table. "I always suspected something was wrong," she began slowly. "Miss Hartley was never unwell, not in the way Mrs. Doyle and the others claimed. I brought her meals sometimes, when I could manage it without drawing attention. She always spoke clearly, always seemed perfectly reasonable to me. It never made sense why she was kept locked away as though she were a danger to herself or others." "Did you ever witness anything specific that suggested her confinement was not for her own protection, but for some other purpose entirely?" Hannah hesitated, glancing toward the door as though fearing someone might overhear even now. "There were papers, sometimes, that Mrs. Doyle would have Miss Hartley's room searched for, though Miss Hartley herself was never given pen or paper to write anything at all. I always thought that strange, that they searched so carefully for documents she could not possibly have created." "Anything else?" "I heard Mr. Whitfield speaking with Mrs. Doyle on several occasions," Hannah continued, her voice dropping lower. "He would ask about Miss Hartley's condition, whether she remained quiet, whether there had been any trouble. And once, I heard him mention needing her signature verified for some document, though I did not understand at the time what he meant by that." Alexander felt a surge of vindication at her words, though he kept his expression carefully composed. "Would you be willing to provide this testimony formally, before witnesses, should it become necessary to establish the truth of Miss Hartley's confinement and the theft of her inheritance?" Hannah's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "I fear what might happen to me if Mr. Whitfield or Mrs. Doyle learn that I have spoken against them." "I will ensure your protection," Alexander promised. You need not fear retaliation while under my protection, and I intend to see that justice is done for Miss Hartley, regardless of the obstacles placed before us." After a long moment of consideration, Hannah nodded slowly. "Then I will do what I can to help her. She was always kind to me, even in her own suffering. She deserves to have the truth known." Alexander returned to Ashworth House that evening with renewed determination, sharing Hannah's testimony with Alina, who listened with an expression caught between gratitude and lingering sorrow. "She remembered me," Alina said softly. "All these years, and she remembered small kindnesses I barely recall offering her." "She remembers your kindness because it meant something to her, even in the midst of everything else happening around you," Alexander replied. "That speaks to your character, Alina, not simply to her memory." The following week, the meeting with Edmund Whitfield's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Charles Pemberton, took place in Alexander's study. Alina insisted on being present, despite Alexander's initial concern that the encounter might prove too distressing for her. "I have hidden long enough," she told him firmly. "I intend to face whatever comes next directly, not from behind locked doors in silence." Pemberton arrived precisely on time, his manner polished and confident as he settled into the chair across from Alexander's desk. Alina sat slightly apart, her posture straight despite the tension visible in her tightly clasped hands. "Your Grace," Pemberton began smoothly, "my client, Mr. Whitfield, wishes to express his deep concern for Miss Hartley's well-being. Given her documented history of mental instability, he believes it would be far more appropriate for her to receive proper care under the supervision of medical professionals, rather than remaining as a guest within your household." "Miss Hartley's history of instability," Alexander replied coolly, "was fabricated entirely, as I intend to prove through documentation and witness testimony already gathered on her behalf." Pemberton's composure flickered slightly before he recovered his practiced smile. "Your Grace, I understand your concern for Miss Hartley's welfare, but surely you must recognize the seriousness of the claims regarding her mental state. Years of confinement were not undertaken lightly, and my client acted only out of genuine concern for her safety and the safety of those around her." "If that were true," Alina spoke up, her voice steady despite the nervousness Alexander could sense beneath the surface, "then perhaps Mr. Whitfield might explain why documents bearing my forged signature were used to authorize withdrawals from my inheritance during the very years I was supposedly too unwell to manage my own affairs, or even to hold a pen at all." Pemberton's expression tightened visibly. "Miss Hartley, I assure you that any financial arrangements made on your behalf were conducted with your best interests in mind, and entirely within the bounds of proper legal authority." "Then you will have no objection," Alexander interjected smoothly, "to a thorough, independent review of those financial arrangements, including comparison of the signatures in question against verified samples of Miss Hartley's genuine handwriting from before her confinement." Pemberton hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the challenge. "I would need to consult with my client before agreeing to any such review." "Of course," Alexander said, his tone remaining perfectly civil despite the steel underlying his words. "Please do consult with him, and inform him that I intend to pursue this matter through proper legal channels, regardless of whether he chooses to cooperate voluntarily. Miss Hartley's inheritance was stolen from her through fraudulent means, and her confinement was orchestrated to prevent her from ever discovering or contesting that theft. I do not intend to allow either injustice to stand unchallenged." Pemberton rose from his chair, his composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "I will relay your position to my client, Your Grace, though I would caution you that pursuing such accusations publicly could prove damaging to all parties involved, including Miss Hartley herself, should questions arise regarding the true state of her mental health." "Is that a threat, Mr. Pemberton?" Alexander asked evenly. "Merely a caution," Pemberton replied, though the implication hung heavily in the air as he gathered his belongings and made his way toward the door. Reputations, once questioned, can prove difficult to fully restore, whatever the eventual outcome of legal proceedings. After Pemberton departed, Alina sat in silence for several long moments, her hands finally unclasping as she allowed herself to release the tension she had been holding throughout the meeting. "He's frightened," she said quietly. "I could see it beneath all that practiced confidence. Edmund knows we have found the truth." "Frightened men are often the most dangerous," Alexander cautioned. "We will need to remain vigilant. Whitfield will not simply accept defeat quietly, not when the stakes for him are so significant." His warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them anticipated. Just 2 days later, as Alina walked alone through the garden during her usual morning routine, she noticed a stranger lingering near the edge of the property, watching the house with an intensity that immediately set her nerves on edge. She hurried back inside, finding Alexander in his study and explaining what she had witnessed. His expression grew grave as he listened. "Describe him to me," he instructed. "Tall, dressed plainly, though not like a laborer. He had a scar along his jaw, and he was watching the house quite deliberately, not simply passing by." Alexander immediately called for increased security around the property, instructing his staff to remain alert for any suspicious presence near the grounds. That evening, he received a hastily written note from one of his stable hands, reporting that the same man had been seen attempting to question one of the kitchen staff about Alina's daily routine and the household security arrangements. "Whitfield is gathering information," Alexander said grimly, showing the note to Alina. "Whether he intends to discredit you further or something more direct, I cannot say for certain, but we must take every precaution." Alina felt the familiar grip of fear tightening around her chest, the same helplessness she had known during her years of confinement threatening to resurface despite everything she had gained since her rescue. Yet this time, she reminded herself, she was not alone, and she was not without resources or allies. "What do you suggest we do?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We accelerate our timeline," Alexander decided. "I will contact the magistrate directly and request a formal hearing into the circumstances of your confinement and the theft of your inheritance. The longer this matter remains unresolved, the more opportunity Whitfield has to cause further harm, whether through intimidation, further fabrication, or something more dangerous entirely." Over the following days, Alexander worked tirelessly to prepare their case, gathering Hannah's testimony into a formal written statement, compiling the financial records demonstrating the fraudulent withdrawals, and securing an independent examiner to compare the forged signatures against genuine samples of Alina's handwriting. Alina, for her part, found herself drawing on a strength she had not realized she still possessed. She spent hours reviewing the financial documents alongside Alexander, her sharp memory proving invaluable in identifying discrepancies and inconsistencies that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. "You have a remarkable mind for detail," Alexander observed one evening, as they worked late into the night surrounded by scattered papers and ledgers. "I had little else to occupy myself with during those years," Alina replied, a hint of dark humor coloring her words for the first time since her rescue. "I spent countless hours simply thinking, remembering every detail of my life before, turning over every conversation, every document I had glimpsed before everything changed. It seems that habit has proven useful after all." Their growing partnership, built upon shared purpose and mutual respect, gradually deepened into something neither of them had fully anticipated. Alexander found himself drawn not only to Alina's resilience and intelligence, but to the quiet warmth that had somehow survived years of cruelty and isolation. Alina, in turn, found herself trusting him in ways she had not believed herself capable of trusting anyone again. Yet even as their bond strengthened, the danger surrounding them continued to escalate. 3 nights before the scheduled hearing, Alexander was woken by the sound of raised voices near the stables. He hurried outside to find his groundskeeper struggling with an intruder who had been attempting to access the house through a rear entrance under cover of darkness. The intruder, a rough-looking man Alexander immediately recognized from the description Alina had provided days earlier, broke free and fled into the darkness before he could be properly restrained, though not before dropping a small knife in his hasty escape. Alexander stood in the cold night air, staring down at the discarded weapon, understanding with chilling clarity that Edmund Whitfield's desperation had escalated far beyond mere legal maneuvering. Whatever the hearing revealed in the coming days, it was now clear that Whitfield intended to protect his stolen fortune by any means necessary, and that Alina's safety, and perhaps even Alexander's own, hung in far greater balance than either of them had initially understood. He returned inside to find Alina already awake, drawn from her bed by the commotion, her face pale with fear as she took in his troubled expression. "What happened?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "Someone attempted to enter the house tonight," Alexander admitted, seeing no purpose in shielding her from the truth any longer. "I believe it was the same man you saw watching the property days ago." Alina's hands trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "Then we must ensure the hearing proceeds as quickly as possible. The longer this continues, the more danger we both face." Alexander nodded in agreement, though privately he found himself wrestling with a deepening concern that extended beyond simple legal victory. Whatever justice they eventually achieved for Alina, he understood now that Edmund Whitfield represented a threat that would not simply disappear with the revelation of his fraud. The coming days would require not only careful legal strategy, but constant vigilance to ensure that both Alina and the truth she carried survived long enough to see justice finally served. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to mirror the tension gripping Ashworth House. Alina stood before the mirror in her room, smoothing the fabric of a dress Margaret had helped her select, one that spoke of quiet dignity rather than the fragility others might expect to see. "You look every bit the woman you truly are," Alexander said from the doorway, his voice warm with quiet admiration as he watched her final preparations. "Strong, capable, and entirely deserving of the truth that will finally be heard today." Alina turned to face him, drawing strength from the steady confidence in his expression. "I confess I am frightened," she admitted. "Not of Edmund himself, not any longer, but of the possibility that the truth might still not be enough, that somehow, despite everything, the world might still choose to believe him over me." "The evidence we have gathered speaks for itself," Alexander assured her. "Hannah's testimony, the forged signatures, the financial records showing years of fraudulent withdrawals. Whatever Whitfield attempts today, the truth is no longer something he can simply hide behind locked doors." The hearing had been arranged to take place at the local magistrate's court, a modest but formal building in the nearby town, where matters of estate disputes and legal grievances were typically settled. Lord Barrington, the presiding magistrate, was known for his careful attention to detail, and his reluctance to be swayed by matters of social standing alone, a reputation that gave Alexander some confidence as they made the journey together that morning. The courtroom was already partially filled when they arrived, a small gathering of curious observers drawn by whispers of the unusual case involving a duke, a supposedly mad ward, and accusations of fraud spanning several years. Alina felt the weight of their stares as she entered, but forced herself to walk with her head held high, refusing to shrink beneath their scrutiny as she once might have done. Edmund Whitfield sat across the room beside his lawyer, Charles Pemberton, his expression carefully composed into an appearance of wounded concern rather than the calculated malice Alina knew lurked beneath the surface. He was younger than she remembered, or perhaps simply less imposing now that she no longer viewed him through the lens of her own captivity. Lord Barrington called the proceedings to order, and Pemberton rose first to present Whitfield's case, painting a careful picture of a devoted relative who had made the difficult decision to provide care for a young woman suffering from severe mental instability, ensuring her safety and well-being despite the personal burden such responsibility entailed. Miss Hartley's condition, Pemberton explained smoothly, manifested in periods of severe confusion and distress, making it impossible for her to manage her own affairs or interact safely with the outside world. My client acted only out of genuine concern, arranging for her care in seclusion while managing her financial interests responsibly on her behalf. Alina listened to the fabrication with a calm she had not expected to feel, understanding that every word Pemberton spoke only strengthened the eventual impact of the truth they were about to reveal. When it came time for Alexander to present their case, he rose with quiet confidence, first calling forward the independent examiner who had reviewed the disputed financial documents. The examiner explained in careful detail the inconsistencies discovered between the forged signatures used to authorize withdrawals from Alina's inheritance and genuine samples of her handwriting from before her confinement, inconsistencies that any careful comparison revealed clearly to the trained eye. Pemberton attempted to challenge the examiner's findings, suggesting that changes in handwriting could simply reflect the natural evolution of a person's penmanship over several years. But the examiner held firm, pointing to specific structural differences in letter formation that went far beyond simple stylistic drift, differences consistent with an entirely different hand, attempting to imitate Alina's signature rather than genuine variation over time. Next, Alexander called Hannah to the stand, watching with quiet pride as the young woman, though visibly nervous, spoke with clear conviction about what she had witnessed during her years working in the kitchens at Thornfield Manor. Miss Hartley was never given pen or paper during her confinement, Hannah testified, her voice growing steadier as she continued. Yet documents bearing her signature were regularly discussed by Mrs. Doyle and Mr. Whitfield, documents she could not possibly have created herself given the strict isolation in which she was kept. Pemberton rose to cross-examine, attempting to suggest that Hannah's testimony might be motivated by some personal grievance against Whitfield or misplaced loyalty toward Alina rather than genuine truthfulness. But Hannah remained steady under his questioning, her account consistent and clear, lending it an authenticity that seemed to resonate throughout the courtroom. Finally, Alexander called Alina herself to speak, and she rose from her seat with a steadiness that surprised even herself, walking to the front of the courtroom with her chin held high despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I was never unwell," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Not before my confinement, and not during the years I spent locked within that room. I refused to sign over control of my inheritance to Mr. Whitfield, as he requested repeatedly in the months before my confinement began. When I continued to refuse, Lord Reginald began telling others that I had grown unstable, and shortly afterward I was moved to the servants' wing and locked inside, told it was for my own protection." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "I spent nearly 7 years in that room. I watched the seasons change through a single barred window. I ate whatever meals were brought to me, spoke to no one beyond the brief exchanges with the servant who delivered them, and slowly watched the world outside continue without me, believing perhaps that I had simply vanished from it entirely." Her voice caught slightly, the first crack in her composed exterior before she steadied herself and continued. "I did not imagine my confinement. I did not fabricate the years I lost, or the documents forged in my name while I sat locked away, unable to hold a pen, let alone sign my own financial ruin. I am asking this court simply to recognize the truth of what happened to me, and to ensure that Mr. Whitfield is held accountable for the years he stole from my life, and the inheritance he stole from my future. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, the weight of her testimony settling heavily over the gathered observers. Even Lord Barrington, known for his careful neutrality, seemed visibly moved by the clarity and conviction of her account. Pemberton rose to cross-examine, though his earlier confidence had noticeably diminished. "Miss Hartley," he began carefully, "can you provide any evidence beyond your own account to support these serious accusations against my client?" "The forged signatures speak for themselves," Alina replied evenly, "as does Hannah's testimony, and the simple fact that I could not have authorized financial transactions during years in which I was denied any writing materials whatsoever, kept locked within a room I was forbidden to leave." Pemberton, finding little ground to challenge her steady testimony, attempted a different approach. "Is it not possible, Miss Hartley, that your memory of these events has become distorted over time, perhaps influenced by your own distress at the circumstances of your care?" "My memory," Alina replied coolly, "has had nothing but time to sharpen itself during the years I spent alone with little else to occupy my thoughts. I remember every detail of what happened to me with painful clarity, Mr. Pemberton, precisely because I had nothing else to distract me from those memories." Her calm, unwavering response seemed to leave Pemberton with little further ground to press, and he returned to his seat with visible frustration, whispering urgently with Whitfield as Lord Barrington called for a brief recess to consider the evidence presented. During the recess, Alina sat quietly beside Alexander, her hands trembling now that the immediate pressure of testifying had passed. "Do you think he believed me?" she asked softly. "I think everyone in that courtroom believed you," Alexander replied gently. "The truth carries a weight that fabrication simply cannot match, Alina. You spoke with the clarity of someone who has nothing to hide, while Whitfield's case relies entirely on obscuring what actually happened." When the hearing resumed, Lord Barrington called Edmund Whitfield himself to provide testimony, and Alina watched as the man who had orchestrated years of her suffering rose to speak, his composure clearly strained beneath the weight of everything already presented against him. "I acted only in what I believed to be Miss Hartley's best interest," Whitfield claimed, though his voice carried none of the smooth confidence Alina remembered from years past. Her behavior in the months before her confinement suggested genuine instability, erratic moods, confused statements. "I believed sincerely that seclusion would provide the calm and safety she required." "And the forged signatures on her financial documents?" Lord Barrington asked directly, his tone carrying a sharpness that suggested his patience for evasive answers had grown thin. Whitfield hesitated visibly before answering. "I may have, on occasion, signed certain documents on Miss Hartley's behalf, believing it necessary given her incapacity to manage her own affairs during that period." "Without her knowledge or consent," Lord Barrington clarified, his expression darkening. "I believed it to be in her best interest," Whitfield repeated, though the words now sounded hollow even to his own ears, the courtroom's growing skepticism palpable in the tense silence that followed. Lord Barrington reviewed the accumulated evidence carefully, consulting briefly with his clerk before addressing the courtroom with clear, measured authority. "Based on the testimony and evidence presented today, this court finds substantial grounds to support Miss Hartley's account of her wrongful confinement and the fraudulent handling of her inheritance. I am ordering an immediate and thorough investigation into Mr. Whitfield's management of the Hartley estate funds, along with the full restoration of any misappropriated inheritance to Miss Hartley's rightful control." A murmur swept through the courtroom at the ruling, and Alina felt a wave of relief so profound it left her momentarily unable to speak. Beside her, Alexander reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady, silently offering the support she needed in this overwhelming moment. "Furthermore," Lord Barrington continued, his gaze settling firmly on Whitfield, Given the serious nature of these accusations, including the deliberate confinement of a young woman under false pretenses and the systematic theft of her inheritance through fraudulent documentation, I am referring this matter for formal criminal investigation. Mr. Whitfield, you will remain within this jurisdiction pending further proceedings." Whitfield's face drained of color as the full weight of the ruling settled over him, his earlier composure shattering entirely as he realized the extent of the consequences now facing him. Pemberton attempted to offer some final protest, but Lord Barrington had clearly heard enough, dismissing the objection with a firm gesture before formally closing the proceedings for the day. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Alina remained seated for a long moment, allowing the reality of the ruling to fully settle within her. Years of stolen freedom, years of forged documents and calculated cruelty, finally acknowledged and addressed by a court that had chosen, in the end, to believe her truth over Whitfield's carefully constructed lies. "It isn't over yet," Alexander said gently, seeming to sense the mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty in her expression. "There will be further proceedings, further investigation, but today, Alina, the truth was finally heard and believed." Alina turned to look at him, tears finally slipping free from eyes she had kept carefully composed throughout the difficult hearing. "Thank you," she whispered, "not simply for finding me that day at Thornfield, but for believing me every single day since, even before there was proof enough to convince anyone else." "I believed you from the very first moment," Alexander replied softly. "Some truths do not require extensive proof to be recognized, Alina. They simply require someone willing to listen." Outside the courthouse, as they made their way toward the waiting carriage, Alina caught sight of Whitfield being escorted away by two officials, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by the hollow expression of a man finally confronted with the consequences of his actions. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet sense of closure, understanding that whatever came next in the ongoing investigation, she had finally reclaimed the voice that had been stolen from her for far too many years. The weeks following the hearing brought a steady stream of developments that gradually restored what Edmund Whitfield had spent years trying to steal. The formal investigation ordered by Lord Barrington uncovered the full extent of the fraud, revealing that Whitfield had systematically withdrawn nearly the entirety of Alina's inheritance over the years of her confinement, funneling the funds into his own accounts under the guise of managing her affairs on her behalf. Lord Reginald's own role in the deception, though he had passed away before the truth could be fully addressed, was also brought to light through careful examination of his correspondence with Whitfield. Letters discovered among his papers revealed a clear understanding between the two men regarding Alina's confinement, though the exact nature of whatever arrangement or pressure had convinced Lord Reginald to participate remained somewhat unclear, lost now to his own passing. Mrs. Doyle, faced with mounting evidence of her direct role in maintaining Alina's confinement, eventually provided her own testimony to investigators, hoping perhaps to lessen whatever consequences awaited her by cooperating fully with the ongoing inquiry. Her account confirmed much of what Alina and Hannah had already testified to, adding further detail regarding the specific instructions she had received from Whitfield over the years regarding Alina's isolation and the careful maintenance of the fiction surrounding her supposed instability. Alina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, in possession of both her freedom and the financial independence that had once been stolen from her. The restored inheritance, though diminished by years of theft, remained substantial enough to secure her future entirely on her own terms, a realization that brought with it a complicated mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. "I hardly know what to do with myself," she admitted to Alexander one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens of Ashworth House, the summer sun warm against skin that had once known only the gray light filtering through a single barred window. "For years, every decision was made for me, every choice stripped away. Now, suddenly, I find myself with more freedom than I know how to properly use. Perhaps freedom is simply something that must be relearned, Alexander suggested gently, much like any skill left unused for too long. There is no need to rush toward any particular decision, Alina. You have all the time now that was once stolen from you, and no obligation to fill it in any particular way. Alina considered his words carefully as they continued their walk, the garden path winding beneath a canopy of blooming roses that filled the air with sweet fragrance. She had spent so many years dreaming simply of escape, of freedom itself, that she had never truly considered what she might do once that freedom was finally achieved. "I think," she said slowly, testing the words as they formed, "that I would like to travel, to see places I only ever read about in books during my childhood before everything changed. And perhaps, eventually, to find some way of helping others who might find themselves trapped in circumstances similar to my own, whether through cruelty or simple misfortune." Alexander smiled, genuine warmth lighting his expression as he listened to her tentative plans taking shape. "Those sound like worthy pursuits, Alina, and should you wish for company along the way, I would be honored to accompany you, should you find my presence welcome." Alina glanced at him, catching something in his tone that suggested his offer carried deeper meaning than simple friendship. In the months since her rescue, their bond had grown steadily, built first upon shared purpose and mutual respect, but gradually deepening into something neither of them had initially anticipated nor fully acknowledged aloud. "Alexander," she said carefully, "these past months you have given me more than simple rescue. You gave me back my voice, my truth, my very future. I find myself uncertain how to properly express what that has come to mean to me." "You need not find the perfect words," Alexander replied softly, stopping their walk to face her fully beneath the shade of a large oak tree that had stood watch over the gardens for generations. "I confess, Alina, that in fighting for your justice these past months, I found myself drawn to you in ways I had not expected when I first discovered you locked away at Thornfield. Your strength, your resilience, the quiet grace with which you have faced circumstances that would have broken many others entirely, these qualities have earned not simply my respect, but something far deeper." Alina felt her breath catch as she absorbed his words, searching his expression for any hint of uncertainty or hesitation, finding instead only steady sincerity. "What are you saying?" she asked softly, though some part of her already understood. "I am saying," Alexander replied, taking her hand gently in his own, "that I have come to care for you deeply, Alina. Not out of pity for what you endured, nor simple obligation as the one who first found you, but out of genuine admiration for the remarkable woman you have proven yourself to be, both before and after everything that was taken from you. I would be honored, whenever you feel ready, to consider a future built alongside you, should you find such a prospect welcome." Alina stood quietly for a long moment, tears rising unexpectedly to her eyes as she processed the weight of his declaration. For years, she had believed herself forgotten by the world entirely, undeserving of anything beyond mere survival within four silent walls. To hear such words now, spoken with such evident sincerity, felt almost too remarkable to fully comprehend. "I never imagined," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "that I might find not simply freedom but genuine happiness after everything I endured. Yet these past months with you, Alexander, have shown me possibilities I had long since stopped allowing myself to hope for." "Does that mean," Alexander asked gently, "that my feelings might be returned at least in some measure?" Alina smiled through her tears, a genuine smile that reached fully into eyes that had known too much sorrow for far too long. "It means, Alexander Ashworth, that I have come to care for you as well, more deeply than I initially allowed myself to acknowledge. You did not simply rescue me from Thornfield that day. You gave me reason to believe that my life still held meaning worth fighting for, worth building toward, beyond mere survival." Their engagement, when formally announced some weeks later, brought considerable attention throughout the surrounding society, though this time the whispers carried admiration rather than the cruel speculation that had once surrounded Alina's reappearance. The story of her wrongful confinement and her eventual triumph over those who had sought to steal her voice and her inheritance both had spread widely enough that many now viewed her not as a woman to be pitied or feared, but as one to be genuinely respected for her resilience and quiet strength. Edmund Whitfield's criminal trial concluded some months later, the overwhelming evidence against him leaving little room for any outcome beyond formal conviction. He was sentenced to a substantial term of imprisonment, along with orders to repay whatever remaining funds could still be recovered from his stolen fortune. Mrs. Doyle, having cooperated fully with the investigation, received a lesser sentence, though her role in maintaining Alina's years of confinement was formally acknowledged and condemned by the court. Hannah, whose brave testimony had proven instrumental in establishing the truth of Alina's account, found herself the grateful recipient of Alina's continued friendship and support, eventually accepting a position within Alina and Alexander's growing household, a role that afforded her far greater security and comfort than her previous circumstances had ever provided. As for Thornfield Manor itself, Alexander made the decision to sell the estate entirely, unwilling to maintain ownership of a property so deeply entangled with the suffering Alina had endured within its walls. The proceeds from the sale were added to Alina's restored inheritance, ensuring her financial security extended well beyond what had originally been stolen from her. On a bright autumn morning, nearly a year after Alexander had first discovered Alina locked away in that forgotten wing, the two were married in a small, intimate ceremony attended by those who had proven their loyalty and support throughout the difficult months of investigation and recovery. Margaret Wells wept openly with joy throughout the proceedings, having watched Alina's remarkable transformation from a frightened, isolated young woman into someone who now stood confidently beside the man she loved, ready to embrace whatever future awaited them together. Alina, standing at the altar in a gown of soft ivory, felt none of the fear that had once defined so many years of her life. Instead, she felt only gratitude for the freedom she had reclaimed, for the truth that had finally been heard and believed, and for the man beside her who had looked past locked doors and years of silence to see the person she had always been, waiting patiently to be found. As they exchanged their vows beneath the same oak tree where Alexander had first spoken of his feelings for her, Alina found herself reflecting on the words he had spoken that day at Thornfield Manor, words that had once seemed simply like an impulsive declaration from a stranger, but which had ultimately proven to be the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her life. He had promised to take her home that day, unaware of the full extent of what she had endured, unaware of the years stolen from her, the inheritance fraudulently claimed by those who should have protected her instead. Yet in the months since, he had proven that promise true in ways far deeper than simple physical rescue. He had given her not merely a house to reside within, but a genuine home built upon truth, respect, and a partnership neither of them had expected to find, but both had come to cherish beyond measure. Alina Hartley, once trapped for years within four silent walls, forgotten by a world that had believed the lies constructed to explain her absence, now stood free, vindicated, and deeply loved, ready to embrace a future entirely of her own choosing. The years of stolen silence had finally given way to a voice fully reclaimed, and a life finally, truly her own.